Welcome to our sixth Outback conversation. Today's topic is economic recovery. What is needed for remote regional economic development after COVID-19? How do we reform policy delivery to support Outback communities? These questions will be addressed today by Fran Kilgariff, former Alice Springs Mayor, and David Arnold, CEO of Remote Area Planning and Development.
Thank you for joining us again today. We are at the sixth session in our series on Outback Australia and the impact of COVID-19. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're all separately meeting. In my case, that's the Jinnaburra people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'm Edwina, I work for Pew, and I'm facilitating the sessions. So today we are going to be looking at economic recovery from COVID-19. We're going to be digging into a little bit more about what is needed for remote regional economic development after the virus, and how we can reform policy delivery to support Outback communities. I'm joined today by Fran and David, who I will introduce more fully in a second. And just any housekeeping for people who haven't been on these sessions so far. If you want to throw a question over, I will be asking questions of both of our speakers after they've both spoken today. You can post your questions in the chat box, or you can send them directly to me via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen there as well. Just remember when you are posting in the chat box to flick the little tag at the bottom to all panelists and attendees so that everyone can read what you're saying. And please also just jump in and introduce yourself and where you're from in the chat box as well, because I know it can be a bit disconcerting for people when they can't see who else is joining us today. Okay, as I mentioned before, our speakers today are Fran Kilgariff and David Arnold. So Fran served as the Mayor of Alice Springs for almost 8 years. Her experience in local government and regional economic development brings a profound understanding of the issues faced by remote communities. She's Commissioner on the NT Planning Commission and Director of a venture affordable housing company. David is the CEO of RAPAD and has been in that position since 2003. He's also the CEO of Rural Financial Counselling Service, North Queensland, and Deputy Chair of the Central West Hospital and Health Board and Committee Member of RDA Fitzroy Central. So we have a wealth of qualifications and experience here today with these two speakers. Fran is going to be speaking first, so without further ado, I will pass over to you to tell us your story, Fran.
Thanks very much, Edwina, and hello everybody, good afternoon. I'm speaking today from Alice Springs, so I guess what I'm going to talk about will have that Central Australian slant to it in our experiences during this pandemic. So I think it's possible already to see some trends even this early in the pandemic. It's not over by any means, and today the Northern Territory got our first case for about 3 months, so that's a bit disappointing for us. But it's brought about change in the way Australians interact, and because of the requirements relating to physical distancing, and that's been a major contributor to this. There's an emerging digital reliance and evolution of digital technologies. I mean, how many Zoom calls have people been on in the last couple of months that never have been on before? And they're changing the interactions of people, I think, in retail, in business, education and health. I think telehealth may be an area which has really blossomed during this time. There was always a background of telehealth, but I think during COVID, people have been encouraged to partake in telehealth much more often. And I think that's something that we're going to see in the future that's going to take great strides in bringing medicine to Outback people that might not actually be able to see a specialist in the city in other ways. So I think that's already an advantage that's showing this. A little bit about where I live and the effects. Alice Springs is a service town for an area that extends into 3 states really, and also incorporates 43 Aboriginal communities. The town's got a population of around about 28,000 people, although it is often difficult to get accurate information. The NT, Northern Territory as a whole, seems to be losing population compared to other states. So much so that in the last few days or the last week or so, we are in danger of losing one of our House of Reps seats in the federal parliament. Aboriginal people in the territory make up around 30% of the population, although federally, I think with a population of just under 800,000 people, they make up just over 3% of the Australian population. In Alice, about 20% of the population are born overseas, and we also have quite a large USA contingent that work at what we call the Space Base, the Joint Research Station here in Alice Springs. So really it's no surprise, given those figures, that the major industries or the major drivers of the economy here in Central Australia are the service industries, health and education related, as well as pastoralism and tourism based industries. There's also a significant proportion of public servants, both Northern Territory and federal, and employees of the 2 regional shires that are based here in Alice Springs. So this proportion of public servants and also money flowing in through the Aboriginal organisations in town can somewhat cushion the ups and downs of the economy even before COVID. And I think that we've found that during COVID, they've also had a very smoothing effect on the economy of this area in some parts of the economy. Edwina, I'm not even going to talk about the federal government or the territory government payments to people, which have also had a significant effect on keeping people afloat at this time. For tourism particularly, which is really an obvious industry in Central Australia and in regional Australia, the tourist population is about 70% domestic travellers and therefore 30% international. Many of those domestic tourists, about 45% of them, are self-drive. And so with COVID, there was an immediate effect on roadhouses, accommodation, hire, businesses. Some larger hotels closed their doors immediately with the consequent loss overnight of hundreds of jobs. Others, such as the resort at Yulara, they did close, but they attempted to keep all their staff there by not charging them rent. And I think that worked to a certain extent as well, although their overheads in keeping that whole resort running during the time were immense. Closure of hospitality venues meant immediate loss of staff, but many food restaurants and businesses have survived by converting their business to takeaway, which actually has reduced some of the costs in the restaurants. In the last couple of weeks, some have not reopened, but many have reopened, and so have managed to make their way through that process. In fact, one venue is reported to have done better under COVID because they had no staff overheads apart from food, and so they had takeaway food and increased alcohol sales, so they actually were making a bit of a profit. There have been some lessons learned in this tourism industry, which makes up about 11% of the Northern Territory workforce. First of all, I think it's the tyranny of distance. It still rules the desert. Better digital communications are required, where many communities, not just the larger communities, many of the Aboriginal communities have little or no access at all to the internet. For example, art galleries in Aboriginal communities, which are really significant in terms of the economies, they pump money into those communities. It seems that they really need to go online in order to be able to make themselves viable. Those galleries which were already selling online before COVID made their way through the whole process, while others, which required visitor access or staff presence, did not do so well. The immediate and long-term future for tourism is uncertain because lead times for tourism are very long, and we're coming into the less attractive or harder to sell times. In regional Australia, it's hot in summer, and in the north it's wet. So the tourist industry mightn't be able to start picking up until next year when international flights in particular resume. In the meantime, many governments, I think, are doing their best to encourage intrastate tourism, and that seems to be providing businesses with some measure of comfort anyway. I know you've already talked about education, but I think that that's also important in terms of the effects of the digital economy. I've talked to a few people in education in regional Australia in the last couple of weeks, and some of them have said that COVID was important in that it provided an incentive for people to actually upskill in IT where they might not have done that so fast. It speeded up IT integration. Many of all the local boarding schools did close. So that meant that the boarders who are home, many of them Aboriginal or some on cattle stations, they didn't have access to digital technologies, so that they were unable to take part in online courses. And I think that that put them at a big disadvantage. So that's another effect on students. Another effect which has been for in education is for students doing gap years, where they are all across Australia, but I think it's particularly effective in regional areas. People doing a gap year to save the money that they need in order to qualify for AUS study, to go to university, they all lost their jobs, so they won't be able to get that money together. So I think that that's an area perhaps where there does need to be policy change and certainly advocacy for those students who won't meet the requirements for AUS study in order to get into university next year. However, one teacher remarked to me that not having other activities at school actually provided the focus for a complete focus on education, which they thought was a really good advantage. So there you are, swings and roundabouts. Another thing which is related to business, but not specifically so, is that I think community safety and security and community coherence actually increased during COVID. I'm not quite sure why. Many of the crimes that have been committed went down, such as vehicle theft, break into houses, all those sorts of things. And I'm not quite sure why, perhaps because people were home more, less car trips, especially to supermarkets. Perhaps that's what influenced it. And people were also urged to stay home, which is perhaps one reason why there was a bit more of a feeling of community safety. However, the downside of that is that in several communities, the statistics of which I've seen is that DV or domestic violence actually went up during the COVID period. So again, you have downsides and upsides to the whole thing. For small business, I think small business in regional and remote areas has been struggling anyway for a while. There's been changing consumer requirements. There's been digital technologies with people buying online. And long-standing successful businesses can be impossible to sell because younger people perhaps are not interested in what those businesses have to sell, or are not interested in the hard work required to build businesses which are not of particular interest to them, which may not any longer fill community requirements. So these businesses, even the ones that are not tourist related, have been hard hit by COVID. People have had less money to spend, and I think it's been quite obvious that the beneficiaries of this have been the largest supermarkets especially, who are able to suppose, have international marketing and bring in more supplies, apart from toilet paper, internationally. So I think the smaller shops have been harder hit than the larger chains. It's going to be quite difficult, I think, to find, try and work out what it's going to be like over the next 12 months in regional Australia. I don't think that this pandemic is over at all in, you know, in the next few weeks or even months. Communities, I think one of the biggest things for regional areas, apart from the businesses that are struggling, is the sense of community coherence that's come through, the requirement for people to actually pull together and to be a community, whereas I think in the past people have been so busy that they might have forgotten to talk to their neighbour or whatever. So yeah, I'll leave it at that, Edwina.
Thank you, Fran. That was really interesting, and we'll have a bit of time to come back at the end and dig in with a few more questions into what you spoke about. All right, David, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Edwina. I could probably just say ditto to Fran. Look, I could probably think of about 90% similarities in what I've got to say. So to set the scene for attendees, so I'm talking from Longreach, middle of Queensland, and the organisation RAPAD that I work for, call it, is owned by, representing the 7 local government areas of Central West Queensland. It's about 23% of the state. Not a lot of us, only about 10,000 now. And in itself, that's a I think I heard Fran say declining. Yeah, we're declining in population. I think back in 2016, used to quote about 12,500 people. So we are witnessing that decline in population. Despite that, our gross regional product has actually risen from about 2011. And in a report we had done by Regional Australia Institute, said the potential's there to grow that even more through to 2031. So again, just to set the scene, some of our, call it, pre-COVID economy and present economy, we're over 65s, we're an ageing population, about 18% of the region in 2016 compared to the rest of Queensland, about 15. We have an ATSI population of about 7%, for Queensland's 4%. And our median age is about 4 or 5 years old, is older than you know, the whole of Queensland. Our top industries by employment is obviously agriculture, very large, 26% of employment in our region compared to about 3% for Queensland. Public administration, about 12% compared to 6% for Queensland. Healthcare, social assistance, education and training, and retail trade are our top 5 you know, sources of employment. But to break it down, I just refer, we're pretty well a 2-sector economy, probably 3 or 4. You know, no doubt agriculture is our, call it, leading, well, some would argue leading industry, although tourism, which isn't very easily defined in statistics, is a strong contributor. And we did our own report, which culminated in just pre-COVID this year, and the spend from tourism to our region's worth about $530 million. So that is significant. Hence, what's COVID done to us? As you'd have to say, like everywhere, annihilated that tourism spend. The upside is, despite being in drought for the best part of 7 or 8 years, commodity prices have held. There has been pockets of rain, you know, in some areas. Diamantina is doing well. The Boolyah Shire doing quite well. So we've certainly got I wouldn't say a strong, but agriculture through this COVID period is in some ways sort of held its head up despite 7 years of drought. So again, pre-COVID, we didn't have a really high unemployment rate out here. And I think anecdotally, my belief is And because I'm involved with the organisation that delivers the federal government CDP across the central, west and southwest, I've got this anecdotal belief when people are out of work here, they just leave and go to the coast, which in itself is a problem. Like if they're going to be employed, I'd like them to be unemployed out here because then that takes, there's a lot of them that have skills and we lose that skills base. So overall, COVID has been another chink on top of a declining population, despite but still strong economically. So that's a bit of a problem, but without a doubt, COVID has knocked our tourism sector around very dramatically. Look, for the next, what's post-COVID? There's a lot of planning going on. I'm privileged to be on the Premier's Industry Recovery Alliance, along with a range of Queensland peak groups. Queensland Reconstruction Authority is leading a planning process. I suppose we won't know what's coming out of that until a few months' time. But in the meantime, like what's COVID done? Apart from, what's been obvious, we've certainly, and the cliched word now is pivot, we have certainly seen some businesses pivot. Just little coffee shops that were relying on a trade have just gone to online, taking their orders online. People have just moved with it. I have spoken to businesses in town and they said they've actually done very well and they don't know what it's for. It's just because people are actually at home. I can tell at my house, and it's my wife does all the work, we have a garden of veggies that just, we didn't have a couple of months ago. So there have been businesses that reported upturns, which is great. For us as an organisation, we started implementing Zoom and Zoom Rooms several years ago. And I use the term, we probably dragged a few people kicking and screaming. But for us, we were really well positioned. And I think the region was well positioned. And I think for us in Outback Queensland, the number of times, you would be invited to be part of panels in, which are Brisbane based or coastal based. And you would sort of be expected to get there, or there might be a teleconference facility. Well, now they're all via Zoom or Microsoft Teams. We're participating equally in these forums along with anyone living in Brisbane. So for me, that's an upside. There's no more 3 days of travel to get to a meeting and get home again. So for us, that's been an upside. Going forward, the world has changed. Agriculture, we have a clean green product here, and there is no doubt this virus has impacted on the whole, clean eating. And I think it's just disrupted supply chains. And we're on the cusp in this region, I believe, that the state government announced publicly money into a study that Professor Ross Garno is doing into manufacturing of renewable energies. And I don't want to say too much, but there's a few other little studies going on that probably wouldn't have really had much of a chance pre-COVID, but with the whole world's supply chains changing, concern, and with the advent of robotics and automation, a lot of those traditional barriers like cheap labour are disappearing. So, perhaps I only saw the ABC the other day. Should Australia get back into wool scouring and manufacture? So, look, that's it, Edwina. I'll pull it up there. But look, there's been impacts, but I think there'll be opportunities out of it.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. I've got a few questions, most of which I was furiously scribbling, and then I realised I didn't have my microphone on mute, so I hope that wasn't too loud for everyone listening in. I'm actually really curious. I feel like one of the themes that we've had throughout this session is that COVID has been in many ways a double-edged sword, and that's certainly come up again today in both of your talks. Fran, I was interested in your thoughts. You talked about the role of public servants, particularly in health and education, smoothing some of the sort of economic ups and downs in regional communities. And I wondered that with, what we've just been talking about, this rise in digital technology and the fact that telehealth and education can now be done more through, you know, Zoom and online. Are there concerns, you know, actually for either of you, that we may see less healthcare or education workers actually coming out to live with their families in remote communities to begin with, because so much of the work can be done online?
Perhaps if I start first, I think that in the future that may be the case. Certainly, it's really hard now to get skilled health workers, highly trained, skilled health workers into regional areas. If there's a possibility that people can stay in their urban practices and still practice their particular speciality, then I think the temptation would be very great to do that. So it may be the case that that does happen.
David, did you have any thoughts on that you wanted to add?
Edwina, could you give me a 5? I was reading a question from Barry Trail. If I wasn't listening, can you just quickly, 5 seconds?
Barry Trail, distracting the panelists with a fairly legitimate question as well. So we'll get to that one. I guess I was just asking about, we've sort of talked, and Fran particularly in her talk had talked about how having, you know, healthcare workers and education workers actually based in regional and remote communities really can kind of cushion some of the blows economically when downturns do come. And we've also talked, and this has been a recurring theme, about how suddenly, hey, we've all realised that we don't all have to be in the same spot to work together to, you know, for education and for healthcare, and whether there are concerns now that actually we're going to see a big rise in health and education workers not actually relocating to regional or remote centres at all, and whether that'll actually impact communities into the future.
Yeah, look, I don't have really an answer one way or another. So I suppose, look, I've got a bit of an insight being the deputy chair of a health board. I don't think it's any secret across all rural and remote regional Australia. You know, we you know, attracting the professional skills base is a bit harder across then coastal areas, both in health, but a range of services as well. But having said that, I believe, you know, in the Central West region, we're doing quite well. I'm not sure whether it's exactly your question, Edwina, but I think there's an opening there, and I don't think your question was leading this way. I think there is an opening there, and we have the tyranny of distance, as Fran touched on, that we just finally realised, well, we haven't, but there's a realisation you don't actually have to be sitting in Brisbane to do a whole range of jobs, a whole range of, like, call it policy type jobs, consulting type jobs. So I would hope, and I think Regional Australia Institute is working on that now, and you know, the potential, I think, with, you know, the potential there is that livability, you know, a whole range of factors that suit here. We potentially could, you know, attract that market now that's stuck at home in the burbs in Brisbane, that they can do their job there and they can effectively do it out here. You know, it's a dedicated, concerted effort, but there's opportunities there. So I don't know whether I answered your question, Edwina, directly, but.
Well, you kind of actually led me into another one. I was watching, I think it was the 7:30 report last night, and there was a mayor, and I should have taken his name down, but a mayor from Western Queensland, and the story was about, you know, how we are potentially going to see this sort of massive increase of people kind of fleeing the cities. And this mayor, and I quote, he said his phone had been ringing hot with people from Brisbane asking, you know, to move out there and what was it like, and, you know, should they relocate with their families. And I actually wondered, you know, was that potentially the mayor sort of maybe exaggerating slightly for the 7:30 report, or have either of you seen this sort of, you know, start of maybe people wanting to make that shift? David, I might throw that one to you first. Oops.
Look, I can't say we've actually seen it, you know, at this early stages, but I've certainly heard that, you know, that comment around, you know, we just want it to come to a realisation. I think it's really important, and this is my own views. Sometimes if you wish too hard for something, you might just get it. And I don't think out here in the central, like, and I'm really cautious of reflecting my own views, like, I don't think we want to see 30, 40, 50,000 people. We want to see a very sustainable, strong population but that doesn't equate to a massive population. 10 families moving to a Barcaldine or a Blackall it is an economic boost. The Blackall Tambo Regional Council got the timber mill up and running a couple of years ago, and it's resulted in, again, that, well, I forget the exact figure, 10 or 15 families with kids, teachers. Like, that's a significant economic boost. So Edwina, no, look, I can't say, yep, we've seen it right now, but hopefully we might see it. But it'll take an effort as well. They won't just come without, call it the region, advertising and selling itself.
Yeah, Barry's just sent me a message saying it was Andrew Martin, the Mayor of Blackall. So that's where the hordes are headed, apparently. So look out.
Edwin, if I could just comment on that as well. I haven't seen a dramatic influx of people, partly because the borders have been closed, but that's another matter. But I think that rural regional Australia has been seen as a safer place than the cities over the pandemic, because the incidence has been so low here, and that perhaps some people are looking for that sort of thing in their life. So it may provide an incentive for some people to actually move. But just very briefly, if I can go back to your question on health, that's the double-edged sword again, providing people in rural communities with sort of access to very high-tech medical assistance that they couldn't actually get in their hometown. So there's 6 to 1, half a dozen of the other in that, I think, like everything.
Yeah. Okay, I've got I'm sort of curious. We've talked a little bit about, sorry, I have a 4-year-old who has clearly realised that I'm missing and is shouting outside my office. So this is the new world order. I guess I'm kind of interested in what's being done. You know, we talked about how, you know, Aboriginal art galleries, you know, I imagine there's a lot of ways that remote communities could be, whether it's, you know, setting up an online shop to sell sort of, you know, locally made skincare products or whatever it might be. Is there much being done at the moment in terms of sort of skilling up people in remote communities on how they could, you know, start small businesses online or kind of access some of the opportunities out there? Fran, that might be a question for you, I think.
There are people that are interested in that area, because access to land, which is generally community held, is such a big issue in terms of people starting a business in communities. So that is one way around it. But honestly, the IT, the access is just so poor at the moment that there's no incentive really to go into that sort of business. But it would be an obvious choice once there is better IT.
Did you have any points that you wanted to add on to that, David?
Look, I think there's again, pre-COVID right now, we got pockets of people who are call it online, for want of a better way of putting it, who are selling products online and making inroads into an Australian and global market. There's a couple of very good examples out here, but they're sort of popping up all the time. I know, and certainly the digitalisation, skilling and upskilling is emerging, coming through all the themes I'm seeing from government planning processes, from the Recovery Alliance I'm on. It's something we've delved in ongoing over several years. Is digital upskilling and even our own venture into Zoom, setting up Zoom rooms. So it's emerging. I would say one thing, and I've said this even to my own mayors, and I said it to the Premier the other day, we understand infrastructure like roads and rail and air. We understand it really well. It equates to jobs straight away. But we still don't really get across, I think, the digital environment and turning that into a jobs equation for government. In some cases we do it, but it's a little bit harder to get across. And I think it's because the digital world has been upon us for decades now, but I just don't think as a whole I'd say we still don't know what we don't know what we don't know in that area. So it's certainly emerging, but we do have to harness that that whole digital environment. And look, we've proven it, or not we, the world has proven with telehealth. It was forced upon us. There's been so much that's been forced upon us, which in some cases has been good.
Fantastic. All right, we're slightly over time. I'm probably going to wrap it up there. Did either of you have any sort of parting thoughts or messages, if there was something out of this period or a message you'd like to be sort of taken, whether it's, policy asks, any sort of final thoughts on pros or cons from this period? David, I'll throw to you first on that one.
Oh, look, I suppose for us out here, it's just not getting left behind. There is no doubt governments have got to facilitate and foster a whole economic renewal, both with, the private sector and alone. We would just hope, we're not, left behind in that. I think that's the most important thing. And if I can answer Barry Trail, it's a good question, Barry. I'm trying to find, Regional Australia Institute has done a range of work on, getting a formula together that would reflect a tourism employment percentage. And I'll try and find it, Barry, and send it to you.
My apologies, that one was just for panellists there, but Barry was asking whether David had a percentage figure of employment in tourism. So that is what that about. Barry also makes the note that the mobility of unemployment has been noticed in other places like Mount Isa and the Pilbara, that when people don't have jobs, they sort of tend to pack up and leave for the coast. So
yeah.
All right, Fran, any parting words from you?
Yeah, a fervent hope. I think that in the future there's going to be a period of immense budget repair with all the outlay from state and governments. And I guess I just hope that the bipartisanship that's been such a feature of the COVID response, that just a teensy bit of that remains when we start to go back to how our budgets get repaired, and that, the regional Australia is not forgotten in all that.
Well, that wraps up our session on economic recovery. A big thanks to Fran and David. In the second last of our series of Outback conversations, the next topic to be discussed is Where to for the Outback. Tyrone Garston from the Kimberley Land Council, Liz Ritchie from Regional Australia Institute, and Mark Stafford-Smith from CSIRO will be reflecting on our previous conversations and what might be needed at the national and local level to ensure that the Outback can survive and thrive in a post-COVID world. All of these videos will be available from our website if you've missed any, so please head to www.outbackalliance.org.au to be able to catch up on any of the series that you may have missed.